We're ready to go. My name is Cesar Perales, and I have the honor of chairing the New York City Charter Revision Commission that was called together by Mayor Bill de Blasio. I will note for the record that we have a quorum. And let me ask each of the commissioners to introduce themselves. Let's start with Marco on the left.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. My name is Marco Carrion. I currently serve as the Mayor's Commissioner of Community Affairs.
While I introduced myself, I didn't tell you who I was or what my background is. I am the former Secretary of State. I'm also a former Deputy Mayor of New York City, and I've served in the federal government. But beyond my public service, I was also the founder and first executive director of the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, now known as Latino Justice. So I have a special interest in not just how the city works, but on the issue of voting rights.
Good afternoon. My name is Wendy Weiser, and I direct the democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice here at NYU School of Law, and I am delighted that that NYU is hosting today's hearing and that you are all here to participate.
Good afternoon. My name is Dale Ho. I direct the Voting Rights Project at the National Office of the ACLU here in New York. I'm also an adjunct professor in the clinical program here at NYU Law School. My practice area is entirely in voting rights and not in campaign finance, but I'm very much looking forward to being educated by the first panel today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Deborah Archer, and I'm a professor here at NYU Law School. In my past life, I was an attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and with the ACLU.
Good afternoon, John Siegel. I'm a graduate of NYU Law School and very happy to be back here. My experience with the campaign finance system, the Campaign Finance Act, actually dates back to its beginning. I was deputy campaign manager and issues director of the first successful mayoral campaign after enactment of the Campaign Finance Act, a campaign that would not have succeeded but for public financing. And I thereafter represented 5 citywide campaigns before the Campaign Finance Board over the years, and glad to see many of my former regulators, adversaries, friends here today.
Hi, I'm Larian Angelo. Right now I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for State and Local Governance at CUNY, and I spent many years doing the budget, both on the city council side and the mayor's side.
Thank you all. Just some brief remarks. The Charter Revision Commission, appointed by Mayor de Blasio, is appointed to examine the entire city charter. But like all mayors that have appointed a charter commission, this mayor indicated a particular interest in having this commission look at the question of elections, the administration of elections, and basically writ large the issue of democracy in our city. It's important that you understand that we've received hundreds of comments on all parts of the charter, but many of them related to the administration of elections. We have gone through a period of hearing from many New Yorkers. We've had hearings in every borough. This meeting, like all of the others, is open to the public and is being live streamed. And many people who listen in and watch us through the streaming mechanism then write in questions, so that we've had hundreds of questions. And we are at the point in our process in which we are focused on some particular issues that have been of special interest to those who have come before us and that are of special interest to the commissioners. And so the panels that we are hearing from this week and next have expertise that they are bringing to the fore. All right. That, is this still picking me up? Great. And that will help us in our determination. Remember that our job is to determine what it is we want to put on the ballot in November, to have the voters of our city determine yay or nay on our recommendations. So that this meeting today is very, very important. We're looking forward to hearing from both of the panels. Before I proceed to introduce the panel, let me just ask Matt Gawalba, our Executive Director, to lay down our ground rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the panelists for being here. So the way that we're going to do it is similar to our previous issue forum, but slightly different for the commissioners. What we're going to do is hear from each of the panelists. I'll give you a 2-minute warning sign. We'll have a brief Q&A after each speaker and a longer and broader Q&A session after all of the panelists have spoken. So because we have a lot of speakers and a great deal of material to cover, what we're going to ask is that during the Q&A after each speaker for the commissioners, that you try to stick to clarifying and understanding points that are somewhat unique to that particular speaker as best we can, and saving broader questions where we want to hear from the full panel for after all of the speakers have gone. So, the best that we can, we'll try to stick to that format, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Matt. Let me now introduce the first panel. To provide us a candidate perspective, Councilmember Carlos Menchaca. To give us some history, Steve Lewis of the New York City Law Department. Key current features, Amy Loprest of the New York City Campaign Finance Board. Performance data, Eric Friedman, also from the Finance Board. Candidate perspective from former council member Rosie Mendez, if she's able to make it. And a comparative analysis by Professor Michael Malbin from the Campaign Finance Institute and SUNY Albany. With that, Councilmember Menchaca.
Thank you. Thank you to the chair and to all the members of this commission. I come here with you, or before you, to talk about my experience as a candidate. And this exercise actually was beautiful to kind of go back and remember those moments that I think are going to be helpful in this discussion. My decision to run for city council came months before the actual election. This was after Sandy had impacted the city, and the work that we were doing in Red Hook really gave me a sense of understanding of how important good government leaders were, how important they were to something like a recovery response. That gave me 9 months, to launch a campaign and win. And I really believe that the campaign finance system phenomenon that we are experiencing right now was critical in that. And there were really 3 things that came to me in my decision to run. First was the affirmation of my family and my loved ones. I needed that first. Second was just being a little bit crazy to go out and take a leap of faith. And then the campaign finance system. I was able to launch a campaign in 9 months to win against an incumbent that had been in power for 11 years, who had figured out a way to keep the position. But what this system allowed me to do was to have a conversation with donors at 5, 10, and my branded experience of $38 for the 38th district about the campaign finance. That was my beginning part of my conversation with everyone, that their dollars would multiply by 6. That allowed folks to feel empowered in a challenger And for people that were not entrenched in the system, which is where I had to go build my political support, became possible. And my average dollar amount for the whole campaign was around $100 average. I won with 59% of the vote, and in a district that is more than half foreign-born and half of the population making under $35,000. This is the community that needs leadership, and with a small time frame, in 2 weeks I raised $40,000, and that is the kind of power that we have as challengers to a government that need new representation. I was also, and I became the first Mexican American elected in the city's history, and also the first openly gay legislator in Brooklyn, out of a district that didn't necessarily give you the impression that that was going to happen. And I have to tell you that the conversations that I was able to have one-on-one with people that said, what can I do to help someone like you get elected? The small dollar donations were the thing that made them feel empowered and part of a campaign to change the direction of this neighborhood that needed it so bad. I think what's important about this discussion is that we can do better. What's important about this discussion is that the better means that we can actually really limit the high dollar donations and keep them all, I would love, at small averages like $175 donations. That keeps our conversations focused on people, our neighbors, that want to be part of government. And because people don't, not everybody knows about this campaign finance board work and the system, it could force us to change the nature of neighborhoods electing neighborhood leaders to represent them. And I'll leave it there for Q&A.
Yeah, I'll take the prerogative of the chair and ask a quick question. As somebody who was out in the community talking to people who wanted an opportunity to participate, did you hear comments about the fact that the government is rigged and that the people who make the big donations are the ones that really influence what's going on?
Without a doubt, that became a real kind of first hurdle for folks to feel like, how are you going to raise money? And this is really coming out of just non-education for regular neighbors in our neighborhood about how something like this happens. And so it was about education. It was about educating people on how this can actually work and demonstrating very quickly when we filed in our first filing over $40,000 that we were serious. And it came from small dollar donations. So this was part of the conversation on the ground. And I think really changed the way people felt connected. And it came back when I ran for re-election just less than a year ago. Really kind of going back to the folks that said yes at $5 and returning with that conversation. So yes, and it's actually changing the way that District 38 understands its own power to elect from here on out.
So I'm wondering if if there was any role of the average contribution number or the relative weight of contributions from small donors to large donors. Did that play at all into the campaign dynamics and the election?
Absolutely. I think I know what your question is. So let me answer it and see if I'm hitting it right. But the donation came with an investment of not just money at $10, but also time. And so folks that had invested in the campaign were able to come in and feel part of the campaign and were part of the machine of our discussions in and around door knocking. And so people felt like there was an investment that they could do at their level, and it multiplied, and they felt like they could come on board to the campaign and actually do the work on the ground to get the word out. And so it created synergy around people feeling like they don't have to be a big corporation. So much of the federal presidential elections shape people's understanding about how all elections work. And so chipping away at that was job number one. And once people felt like they can invest their money at $10, $38, we invited them, and they became some of the strongest on-the-ground operation volunteers for me throughout the campaign.
I think this is just a clarifying question. You said you wanted to limit high dollar contributions. Are you recommending a cap on contributions? And if you are, you floated the number on 150, 175. I don't remember which one you said. And if you could help by telling us your thinking about why that would be the cap that you would set.
I think about people wanting access to a campaign, to a candidate, to a process where they can feel like they have an equal voice. And this idea that we can limit campaign contributions so that at the end of the day, the fuel for a campaign comes from everywhere, from not corporations, but wealthy and non-wealthy, that they can be in the same space with the same kind of investment is exciting. And so I think that's where the proposal is coming from, so that they can be in a room, say we're doing a fundraiser, say we're doing a kind of launch, a campaign launch, that everyone there that has invested knows that everyone else had a cap, and that their dollar matters, and that all their dollars are kind of equal in that opportunity for expansion. So that's my dream. That helps us as candidates stay focused on everyone that is donating.
The councilman has to leave. I will allow one more question. I think someone on that end, was it you, John, or?
No, I think Deborah has another.
It was just, I wanted to know why you're picking the number 150. Why is it?
Well, I mean, that's the one I know well, so it helps, or I should say, it's coming just from my own experience on the ground. Asking for $175 is easier than asking for $2,000 from a family. So this is about creating an opportunity, because the low dollar and the activation of the six match is whatever that number has to be, whatever that is good, but it's a different ask if it's over $2,000. That's a different profile. And what I'm saying is that there's a really great opportunity for kind of equal access to the base of a foundation for a candidate like myself, who was an insurgent, a challenger. And I think what's the story behind all this is really a question about how we can confront entrenched elected officials that will always have the support of powerful interests. And this system allowed me to launch a campaign in 9 months, from nothing to something, and allowed me to have the conversation that we're having here today, and really inspired a group of people that didn't even know that this even existed. I think that's a whole other component to this. How do we get more education out to folks to know that they can actually impact a local leader in their neighborhood to fight for them the way that they want to be heard? And I think that was the spirit of the campaign that could have only happened if they knew that their dollars at 175, and there's some people that were able to kind of over the course of time get to 175 and be proud of that their dollars are going to multiply by 6. It's a game changer for folks that don't feel like they have any voice against these larger, wealthier people in a neighborhood that I think seem to feel like they get all the power in an election like this.
Given this commission's commitment to democracy, let me exhort you to go back and vote.
Yes. We're about to pass a budget, and I'm really excited about that. As excited to be here with all of you, and I want to wish everyone a happy Pride. Thank you.
Steve Lewis.
Okay. So I'd like to thank the commissioners for inviting me to reminisce a little bit about the time back in 1987, and that era when we were first looking into campaign finance laws. And in fact, the City Council first passed the law that obviously has changed in many ways over the years, but in basics is still sort of the 87 version as introduced, the 88 version as passed, remained the sort of the basis for the program up until today. And just to remind everyone a little bit of the time period, the mid to late 80s, Ronald Reagan was president, Ed Koch, of course, was the mayor, Rudy Giuliani was the U.S. attorney, making a name for himself. So the bill, sort of start with the bill and then work backwards in time a little bit. The bill, which was introduced in September 1987 by council members Katzman, Messenger, and Michaels at the request of Mayor Ed Koch. The bill actually was first, or in its initial form, had been drafted by members of the New York City Law Department, the Corporation Counsel's office. It was a major initiative by the then Corporation Counsel, Peter Zimroth. It went through some revisions over the course of legislative discussion, but its essentials remain pretty much intact. So, I think the main question right now is, well, what triggered this response? Why did the city feel it had to engage in what was at the time a pretty radical, actually to some extent still, as it turns out, a fairly radical approach to campaign financing by providing for public funding? And like any lawyer, I go right to the record and look at the law itself and look to the legislative intent and findings in Section 1 of that law, Local Law 8 of 1988. And to quote straight from it, both the possibility of privilege and favoritism and the appearance of impropriety harm the effective functioning of government, whether or not the reliance of candidates on large private campaign contributions actually results in corruption or improper influence. It has a deleterious effect upon government in that it creates the appearance of such abuses and thereby gives rise to citizen apathy and cynicism. And it went on to note that special conditions had arisen in the city of New York as a result of the presence of unique concentrations of wealth and financial power, which require special measures pertaining to ethics in government. So what had happened to provoke this rather radical response? And there were, although perhaps forgotten by some, there were an extensive and wide-ranging series of corruption scandals rocking New York City in the mid-1980s. It did not simply involve local, or it did not involve city officials necessarily. There are a number of state and federal officials also implicated. And actually, most of them did not directly involve campaign donations, although some did. But it seemed for a while that everyone was in on it, that politicians up and down the line, city officials, federal members of Congress, were all on the take one way or the other, either taking money or giving money, granting favors in exchange. Just to highlight a couple of probably the main ones that hurt the city greatly and resulted in this law. I just want to mention WedTech. I don't know if any of you may remember WedTech. It was at the time thought to be an outstanding company in the South Bronx, helping to lead its revival. It received a lot of no-bid military contracts from the federal government because it was thought to be a minority-owned business. It was not. That was almost the least of the issues. Congressman Mario Biaggi, jailed on various racketeering charges. Stanley Simon, the Bronx Borough president, also convicted of multiple crimes, including taking a bribe from WedTech, which included some of the campaign contributions, that he took the contributions in exchange for his help in winning Board of Estimate approval for a contract that it was seeking. and he was accused of taking campaign contributions from other companies as well in exchange for favors. Then there was the Parking Violations Bureau. Stanley Friedman, the Bronx Democratic Party boss, bribed officials to get a PVB contract directed to a company that he was associated with. He gave Queensborough President Donald Maness and the PVB deputy director stock in that company in exchange to get the contract. That, of course, was a major scandal. Unfortunately, Borough President Maness took his own life, which, of course, in a city that gets caught up in tabloid stories, suddenly became its own sensation and just ratcheted up the sense by the community at large that there was a severe corruption issue in New York City. And I just wanted to note, he was ultimately cleared, but at the time, State Senator Manfred Orenstein, really just before the bill was introduced, he was indicted on charges of misappropriating state legislative funds for campaign work. So again, everyone in the business of politics seemed to be, one way or the other, committing crimes, taking money, or spending money inappropriately. I know we're pretty much out of time. I saw the little clock. I just wanted to quickly jump through the fact that right after all those incidents, Governor Cuomo, Mayor Koch established various commissions, the Sovereign Commission, the FEAR Commission. They all looked into these issues, how to deal with them, and campaign finance reform, including public financing, was at pretty much the top of the list in terms of what they thought would be an appropriate response. And the state legislature did not act, except in a minor way. And so it was really left up to the city, which stood up to the plate and passed that law, as I said, in early 1988. So, there we go.
I mean, people my age like to hear the story that we all remembered as young people. So, I for one enjoyed your presentation, but basically, so that we will be educated. You gave us the circumstances in which the city acted for the first time. Basically, how would you describe what was what was that law that was passed? How did it influence or determine campaign finance?
Well, I mean, that law was really the city's law. And I should say there were certainly many approaches that were discussed. And in fact, I mentioned before, the state legislature passed sort of an early version of a so-called pay-to-play law, a so-called Goodman law that restricted contributions by those who were appearing before the Board of Estimate. It was very convoluted and complicated law. But, we did the basic, not with all or certainly not as much of the multiple matching that we have now, but, basically the one-on-one matching. It's set for. I think the basic framework of the current law really existed at that point.
Seems appropriate to turn to Amy at this point to tell us where we are.
Okay. Well, I can thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about our public matching funds program and the work of the board. As has been spoken about before, the Public Matching Fund program amplifies the voices of small contributors in the political process and aims to decrease the possibility of corruption or the appearance of corruption from large campaign contributions. Candidates who are running for city office, mayor, public advocate, comptroller, borough president, and city council member can voluntarily choose to participate in the program and receive matching funds for their campaign for office. For participating candidates who qualify, the program matches the first $175 of contributions by New York City residents at a 6-to-1 ratio. This means that if a contributor gives $10, that is matched with $60 in public funds, bringing the total value of that contribution to $70. When it was established in 1988, the program matched contributions to $1,000 at a rate of 1-to-1. The rate was changed in 1998 to provide a 4-to-1 match for the first $250 per contributor, and was increased again in 2007 to the current 6-to-1 formula. The establishment of the multiple match and the subsequent increase changes each effective incentives for candidates to seek small dollar contributions and increase the role of small contributors in the funding of local campaigns. As there were in 1988, there are limits on contributions that apply to all candidates, whether or not they choose to participate in the matching funds program. The limits were subject to an increase earlier this year pursuant to the Campaign Finance Act. For the next election, the contribution limits are $2,850 for City Council, $3,950 for Borough President, and $5,100 for the citywide offices. Contributions from people outside of New York City and organizational contributions from political committees and unions are allowed, but they're not matched by public funds. Candidates have been prohibited from accepting contributions from corporations since the 1998 charter amendment enacted by citywide referendum. Non-participating candidates have been subject to the contribution limits, the corporate contribution ban, and disclosure requirements since the passage of legislation in 2004. In the year since, legislation was enacted to put new restrictions on special interests to further reduce the risk of corruption through the financing of campaigns. A 2006 law prohibited the matching funds for contributions from lobbyists, their spouses, and domestic partners. A more expansive set of limits was added to the Act in 2007. Contributions from LLCs and partnerships were prohibited, and new limits and restrictions were added to reduce the appearance of pay-to-play in city politics. If a contributor has business dealings with the city at the time of their contribution, they are subject to a lower doing business contribution limit of $250 for City Council, $320 for Borough President, and $400 for citywide offices. These limits apply to everyone in the doing business database, which includes lobbyists, anyone who is the chief officer of an entity with the city business dealings, has at least 10% ownership interest, or is a senior manager or oversees business with the city. These limits apply to all candidates, and doing business contributions are not matched with public funds. In order to receive public funds, candidates must meet a two-part fundraising threshold to show that they have significant support from those they wish to represent. Those running for City Council must raise $5,000 in matchable contributions and collect $75 contributions of $10 or more from residents who live in their City Council district. Mayoral candidates must raise $250,000 in matchable contributions, with at least 1,000 contributors giving $10 or more. In my written testimony, you'll see the thresholds for all the other offices. I'm not going to go into them. Once a candidate meets the threshold, they must be on the ballot and have an opponent to receive most of their matching funds. Candidates must also demonstrate compliance with the Campaign Finance Act and not have any outstanding penalties or repayment obligations from previous campaigns. Under a recent amendment to the Act, the board will disperse early payments to candidates who have met the threshold in June. These early payments will be limited to $10,000 for City Council, up to $250,000 for Mayor. The majority of public funds are paid out to candidates after the ballot is set, which is a little more than 1 month before the date of the election. By joining the program, candidates agree to abide by strict spending limits that vary by office. These spending limits ensure that the amount of money raised is not the deciding factor between candidates, while also allowing candidates the ability to get their message out to voters. These limits are adjusted for inflation after each 4-year election cycle. The chart is in the testimony. They range for mayor, $7,286,000 to $190,000 for city council for the primary, and then again for the general election. Public fund payments are capped at 55% of the spending limit established for that office. This ensures that campaigns have a mix of public and private funds. In 2021, the maximum payments to mayoral candidates will be $4,007,300. For city council candidates, the maximum payment will be $104,500. Candidates must demonstrate they have spent public funds on items allowed under the campaign finance law, known as qualified expenditures. A key component of our system is that we have some of the best disclosure requirements in the country. Throughout the election cycle, all candidates are subject to thorough disclosure requirements. Campaigns must regularly report their financial activity, which is published online, so the public can find out who their candidates are raising money from and how they're spending it. Documentation is also closely audited by our staff before, during, and after the election to make sure candidates qualify for public funds honestly and ensure candidates are appropriately spending those funds. Not only does our rigorous process safeguard the taxpayers' money that goes towards campaigns, but it ensures that candidates are treated the same as their opponents, regardless of their political party, background, or whether or not they hold elected office. In 2010, voters overwhelmingly approved an amendment to the charter requiring that independent spenders disclose their activity to the CFB. This requirement was further strengthened through subsequent legislation. Independent groups that spend more than $1,000 to support a candidate or ballot initiative must report not only the owners, officers, and board members of the organization, but also must report details about where their major funders, those who contribute more than $50,000 to that entity, get their funding. Any communications put out by independent spender must include a pay forward by notice that includes the names of the entity's principal owner, CEO, and top 3 donors, along with a URL directing voters to the CFB's website for additional information. An essential condition for the success of the Public Matching Funds program is the structure of the Campaign Finance Board as set in the city charter. The CFB is an independent and nonpartisan agency. We have a 5-member board appointed by the mayor and the speaker of the city council. The appointments made by the speaker and the mayor must not be from the same political party, but the charter does not specify which parties those appointees must represent. This means that the board is strictly nonpartisan as opposed to bipartisan. This means that the board does not become hamstrung by partisan gridlock, and enforced matters do not break along party lines. The nonpartisan nature of the board has also allowed us to build a staff of qualified professionals whose party affiliation is not taken into account. Another critical element of our structure is our continued independence. In addition to our nonpartisanship, we are a non-mayoral agency, which further ensures that we remain separate and apart from political concerns. We have independent budget authority, which was added through a charter amendment proposed in 1998. The board represents the mayor with its budget request in March, which the mayor is required to include without revision in his executive budget, which he submits to the council. The 1998 commission specifically included this proposal to insulate the board from political pressure. Now, I'm happy to answer your questions, but Eric Friedman for our office has a presentation about a data analysis of how the program worked in the 2017 citywide election.
Why don't we just go immediately?
Okay, thanks very much. Again, my name is Eric Friedman. I am Assistant Executive Director for Public Affairs at the New York City Campaign Finance Board. And I want to thank you and the commissioners for the opportunity to demonstrate the impact of the Master Funds program we have and also illuminate a few areas of focus for further reforms. So I'm going to start with a quick case study that demonstrates the effectiveness of the program and why it works. So one of the things that we do to explain the impact of the program is to draw a comparison between what happens here and at the state and federal levels. So we're going to look at a single neighborhood in New York City and the way that their incumbent representatives raise funds for their campaign. I won't say which neighborhood we're talking about or which lawmakers we're talking about, because the point is not to talk about the individuals, but about the systems. So we're going to look at a member of Congress who has about $1 million budget for his reelection in 2016. As you can see all the way on the left, he's got a tiny sliver of his fundraising from small contributors of $200 or less than 1%. The lion's share, more than 3/4 of his budget, comes from political action committees. We have a member of the State Senate who has a smaller budget, but and does a little bit better with his small contributors, about 7%, but also relies heavily on PACs and LLCs and corporations who can give to candidates at the state level. Almost 90 cents of every dollar he raised comes from these kind of special interest entities. So then we turn to a member of the city council. So you look at city council, our city council member has a larger share of his contributions that come from small dollar contributions. And when combined with the public matching funds, make up more than a majority of his overall funding at 62%. Only 25% from PACs. So, if you lived in this neighborhood, I mean, we talk about perceptions, right? So if you live in this neighborhood, what candidate are you going to trust is putting the interests of you and your neighbors first? Right? The matching funds program means that candidates are spending less of their finite time during a campaign seeking funds from these big money special interest entities and more time in their neighborhoods seeking the support of the people they hope to represent. It's a typical story, and I think you see it repeated over and over again throughout the city. By and large, the majority of funds raised by candidates come from city residents. This is a little bit more true, certainly for city council than it is for citywide, but the matching funds program keeps candidates close to home. And when they are in the city, and what you're looking at here is a map of contributor activity across the city, across the entire 2017 election. And some of the most active neighborhoods when it comes to small dollar contribution activity are miles away from, I think, what most people think of as the kind of traditional big money contributor areas on either side of Central Park or in Brownstone, Brooklyn. All over the city, contributors are getting involved in supporting candidates. And you heard Councilmember Menchaca and his story. That story, again, repeats itself all over the city. So a few more basic statistics about the 2017 election in the context of the past few election cycles. And one thing to note as we go through is that 2017 was a little bit of a different election than the few previous, and there were more incumbents running on the ballot than really in any election since 2005, with the way the term limits shake out. But one of the things to note is that the program, since the advent of the multiple match in 2001, has had consistently high levels of participation, higher than 80%, in most cases higher than 90% in the primary election, and then above 60% in the general election. The participation dipped slightly in the 2017 election, but still higher than 80% for the primary. And the participation in the general election has really remained consistent across elections. Just briefly, because of the number of incumbents on the ballot and fewer challengers, the overall cost of the program dipped in 2017. The $17.7 million or so paid to candidates was really the least, the lowest number we've had since the advent of the multiple match, with term limits opening up most offices for 2021. We expect that number to go back up considerably. So we're going to look a little bit at a few charts that illustrate the role of small dollar contributors in the system. The vast majority of people who do contribute are small dollar contributors. That is slightly more true in 2017. Overall, and if you look back at the past several cycles, between 2/3 and 3/4 of all contributors are giving $175 or less. Those contributions, they make up a smaller portion of the candidate's overall fundraising, for sure. Smaller for citywide candidates, for mayor, public advocate, controller, those small dollar contributions are making up probably less than 10% generally of their overall fundraising, whereas for council, it gets up closer to 30% pretty consistently. So we're going to look next at a distribution of contributions from individuals in the last two mayoral elections. So on the left here in green are contributors. On the right in red are contribution totals, so overall dollars. So one of the things you see when you look at the distribution is the impact of those maximum size contributions all the way on the right, and especially in these mayoral races. So when you look at contributors, it's a little bit of a J-shaped distribution, right? While most donors are small donors, there is an uptick on that far right of the chart for people who are giving the maximum amount of $49.50. So for 2017, there were 665 individuals who gave that maximum $49.50 contribution to candidate for mayor, combined with around 14,000 who gave $175 or less. Yet those 665 contributors made up nearly half of the overall fundraising for mayoral candidates. And as you can see, the distribution, the shape of these charts looks roughly the same in 2013 as it does for last year's election. It's those tall bars all the way on the right that represent still what is the greatest risk for an appearance of corruption under the current system. Contributors who can write $5,000 checks or bundlers who can deliver piles of $5,000 checks. Looking at similar distribution for city council, the charts look different. The small contributors on the left are playing a much larger role. There are more of them proportionally in comparison to the larger donors. And as you can see, this is a story that is consistent across the past 2 elections. And when you look at the distribution of dollars there on the right, council candidates end up being much less reliant on the contributors at the higher end of the scale than their counterparts running for mayor. And in both cases, the contributions of $500 or less are a majority of the overall money they raise. So just to close, when you add in the public funds, it means those small dollar contributors are playing an even greater role in campaigns. Again, council candidates are more reliant on public funds than are candidates for citywide office, though public funds are still, these 4 candidates for controller, public advocate, mayor, they're making up a significant portion of their budget, but not nearly as much as it is for city council. And one of the things we will be talking about later is finding a way to get those citywide candidates to increase their focus on small dollar contributors. And with that, we'll happy to take questions.
Yes, good job.
So listening to these 3 presentations combined, on focusing on the anti-corruption impact of the system, I think it's true that since 1989, when this system took effect, there have not been indictments and convictions of high-level city officials and political leaders, certainly not of the sort that Steve described, of county party chairs and borough presidents and the like, literally being convicted of corrupt acts. During the same period, if you look at our state government, at risk of profound understatement, there have been a nearly endless series of personal and governmental corruption charges, trials, downfalls, etc. To what extent do you think it's fair to attribute the public matching funds system in the city for that difference? And is there any reason to believe that if we were to yet further lower the contribution limit, that it would have an impact on any continuing problem of perception of the possibility of corruption at that level?
Well, I guess, our statistician who's sitting in the back always reminds me there's a difference between causation and correlation. So, I don't know if we can say that the Public Matching Funds program is the cause of the difference in those 2 facts that you pointed out. I do think that it definitely helps elect a different kind of people, as Councilmember Menchaca explained, from his own personal story. I do think that it attracts and enables people who are come from a different kind of experience than perhaps in the past or perhaps at the state level, to be able to run and be successful in running for office. I think that part of the job of the program is to make the appearance that the government is more responsive to the people. And the Small Dollar Matching Funds program really does that. You have an investment in your council member or your, any level of office by giving a small dollar contribution. They are seeking those small dollar contributions, as you can see from Eric's presentation, at large numbers, and really making those contributions more valuable is very important part of the process. I'll steal a quote that I heard from someone who's an advocate in Seattle, but I think it's a very apt description. In order to build trust in government, you have to make government trustworthy. And this is sort of what we're trying to do, is making the government more representative of the people they represent makes people have more trust in their government.
I'm wondering if you've done, if you can talk a little bit, based on your analysis of why there's a dip in participation in the public financing system in the general elections, and also if there's some differences in characteristics between who participates and who doesn't participate and where they get their funds from.
Certainly. So when you look at the general election, the reason that participation rate is a good deal lower than the primaries, you have a lot of candidates who don't have much campaign activity, right? So out of 64 candidates in the last election overall who didn't participate in the program, 28 of them reported spending not a single dollar on their campaign. And there's an additional number who had very small campaigns. I mean, I think there's some number at the higher end, right? There is a small number of candidates who rely on self-funding. There is a number of incumbent members of the council, particularly, who didn't have much competition and opted not to participate, so as not to use taxpayer funds for their campaign. One of the changes to the law that was enacted in 2016 provided the ability for candidates to rescind their certification, right? Candidates have to opt into the system by June 10th, before an election. So the new law, Local Law 193 of 2016, provided the ability for candidates to opt out again as late as the end of July. And that happened about 4 times in 2017. So for candidates who aren't sure whether they'll have an opponent, they can kind of wait and then kind of opt out of the system in July. And again, it's responsible for a small number of opt-outs. But together, I think that's what, hopefully that gives a little bit better picture of.
And just to clarify, it means that the non-participants are not largely raising large outside dollars. They're just not spending very much for the most part.
Correct.
And one thing is that what's true, except for people who are self-financing their own campaigns, candidates who are non-participants are bound by the same contribution limits. So their fundraising patterns are similar to.
Again, just one other detail. So of those 64 non-participants in the 2017 election, 2017 elections, only 9 of them actually spent higher than the spending limit for candidates in the program. So just as a little context.
Let's take advantage of the fact that we don't have too many more questions at this point to move on to former council member Mendez, but you can expect questions from us when you're all finished. Council member?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I've been intricately involved in 7 campaigns in Council District 2. 3 for my predecessor, Margarita Lopez, 3 for myself, and 1 for who is now my successor in the seat. Back in 1995, when we were looking to run someone against the incumbent, it seemed daunting to raise the kind of money we needed to raise. I was part of this inner circle. We were having lots of meetings, and we started very early because we knew we still had to raise a lot of money. That was when it was the 1-to-1 match. And at the end of the day, the incumbent decided not to run for re-election, but we had another incumbent of sorts. The chief of staff to Sheldon Silver decided to run, and she was treated as the incumbent. So luckily, we had started early collecting money and doing a lot of work on the ground that it helped us level the playing field. I don't remember how many volunteers we had then. We had many. But it was the boots on the ground from committed individuals and the campaign finance and a candidate who worked like a horse that enabled us to win the seat. And hence, years later, when term limits was kicking in, it was that successful run that made me seriously consider running. Without the matching funds, I don't know that I would have left my job for a year to run for office and to do everything that was needed to ensure running for office. By the time I ran for office in 2005, though, what happened is I saw a lot of people moving into the district to run. And actually, one person I don't think really moved into the district, just used an address in the district. I challenged 4 individuals who did not meet the requisite of signatures, who would have been eligible for, it cost me the New York Times endorsement, by the way, but these individuals got like 1,000 signatures or less. We needed 900 signatures at the time. And we had 7 people then running in my seat. It was still a very lively race and campaign. The following years in other seats and in other races, what I saw even in my district is some people who weren't seriously considering, or seriously running for office, running because the amount of signatures have been lowered in the city council race from 900 to 500. And because of the generous campaign finance, they did fundraise a little bit, but I took every race serious. I was out there campaigning every day, and some of these individuals were not there until the very end. But I think this system is very important. It helps people who would otherwise not run. I would not have convinced my successor to run if we had not been able to do this successfully, if as grassroots activists, we had not had a winning formula and a background in our community to show that people will take us seriously, and in all those cases, we all, when it was an open seat, did not work for like close to a year in order to dedicate ourselves to the race. So the campaign finance didn't help pay our expenses, but it made us viable candidates, and that was important. I'm 2 minutes left, or 2 minutes. I'm trying to remember, there were a couple other things, and I didn't write down a little list for myself.
I've got a couple of questions that may help you get to that.
Okay, then let's do that.
I know that the prior questioning has gone to the issue of corruption and how this system has perhaps helped limit corruption. I'm more interested in more candidates getting into the race, and I think you spoke to the fact that you see yourself as a grassroots candidate, that you were part of a group that was grassroots, and you suggested that you may not have been able to run had it not been for the contribution matching. Do you think that increasing the matching percentage will result in more candidates running? Do you see more candidates running as a good thing or a bad thing? Because you sort of implied that people sometimes will move into a district to run who may not have much constituency support. Just talk a little bit about the impact you think raising contribution limits, the match, to a much greater extent, would make a difference.
I think more people running is a good thing. I do think, though, that, when we had the higher limits of signatures, then it weeded out people who were not really serious about running. I also think that there should be some kind of residency requirement. Like I said, there was one individual that I know did not live in the district, used someone's address, and got matching funds, hooked up with one of my political opponents who helped fundraise and meet the criteria to get the matching funds. So I think it's important. I think more money will help more people run, but I also think it needs to be tempered with something a little more stringent so that people who are serious about running are benefiting, and other people who are just either running as spoilers or, trying to be a pain, are out there. So there was one year where I had one candidate, and he was the only candidate, and he wasn't serious about running, and he qualified to be on the ballot because of the lower amount of signatures and the campaign finance ability.
Sorry. Yeah, so you just mentioned that.
Why don't you introduce yourself, because you got here a little late and nobody knows who
Thank
you
you.
are.
Thank you. And my apologies for getting here late. So my name is Aneta Sicharan, and I run an organization called Chaya Community Development Corporation based in Queens. So you just mentioned that there should be some more stringent rules tied to, if we were to support increasing the matching funds, that there should be some more stringent rules tied to that. What are some thoughts you might have around those kinds of rules?
Well, the residency requirement, which I think I don't know how long you have to live in the district. I know when there is a redistricting, you don't have to live in the district. As my 2013 campaign candidate did not live in the district, but said he would move in. Certainly people who have a lot of money can sort of decide what district they want to move in to run if it's more appealable. Those options sometimes not available to other grassroots candidates. You know, the amount of signatures, I think it's important. The state changed the amount for city council from 900 to 500. So in 2017, I ran for a small political post called Democratic District Leader. I needed 500 signatures in what we call the heart of Alphabet City, from Avenue B to the East River, from 14th Street to Delancey. Our city council candidate needed 500 signatures from East Broadway to 35th Street, from 5th Avenue to the East River. So, you know, there seems to be a discrepancy, and, you know, people who are moving into districts or who've been there for a little while and decide to run, I think previously when they would look at those higher numbers of what you need to qualify on the ballot, would make a decision whether they're going to run now or in a couple of years and put more work into the community. So you know, and that's a state issue, how many signatures are needed to qualify for a particular seat.
I've got a follow-up question that is perhaps not directly related to what we've been talking about. But in return for the receipt of public matching, citywide candidates are required to participate in debates. Is that not so? Yet, candidates for the city council receive public funds and need not participate in any debates. Is that also true?
That's correct. The law does not have a debate requirement for
Exactly.
any office but citywide offices.
Yeah. I, for one, don't understand that, but not that I want to prejudice the answer, but would you, former council member Mendez, given your sense that there are people that show up wanting to run for office who have no relationship to the community, do you think it would be good if everybody were forced to debate?
You know, I don't know what would be entailed administratively, which doing debates in every district. I mean, there have been cases where we've seen, you know, 12 candidates in a city council seat. I can tell you there are always debates. So a lot of the not-for-profits in the community will do debates. The League of Women Voters, I know in my race and in some other races, have done debates. So there's always an opportunity for people who are interested to catch those debates. Now with social media, you know, they get live streamed. So, you know, I remember we had a local debate last summer for the city council race on, it was on housing and cultural groups, and it was being live streamed through Facebook, and a lot of people were able to watch it.
I'm not trying to be rude, but is that a yes or a no? Do you think if you get money from the citizenry, from the public, you should be required to participate in at least a debate?
I think you should participate in a debate. I don't know that it needs to be organized by the city.
I think we've got one more panelist, Professor Michael Malbin. You've got the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Perales, members of the board, staff. Does this work? My time begins when it works. So I gave you a much longer written statement. I submit that for the record. I'm going to summarize. Yes. Okay, so I was asked to speak about where the city fits nationally. This first slide, in order to save time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that first slide. The types of public financing systems before the city went to multiple matching grants, partial grants, mixed systems, tax credits, rebates, most of those began in the 1970s after Watergate. Starting in the 1990s, 1996 in Maine, there was a move toward 3 states adopted full public funding. The goal behind full public financing was to get all private money out of politics or out of candidate support. That system is still going in those 3 states and still doing reasonably well with modifications, but they were given they was significantly hamstrung by a Supreme Court decision that affected a form of differential support for candidates. And in addition, Citizens United made it absolutely clear that you can't get large money out of politics. You can get money out of going directly to candidates, but clearly independent expenditures are constitutionally protected. The city was the first to adopt a multiple matching system of more than 2-for-1. And what was important about the city is that it was the first one to articulate and act seriously on a different goal. And that goal was to stimulate citizen participation and small donor participation. That was new. It didn't really catch on in a lot of other jurisdictions. It was mentioned, and a number of us had mentioned it as something people should look at, but what really caught on was after Citizens United. And people realized, we can't get private money out, but maybe we can build from the bottom up, and that'll change the balance in the system. And then you began seeing a lot of other jurisdictions looking at it. Los Angeles became the 2nd major city to adopt multiple match. And then you have new ones since. Montgomery County, Maryland has gone through the first set of primaries since, and District of Columbia and Howard County, Maryland are enacting but have not yet gone through a test. And then there's yet another new system, vouchers, adopted in 1 city so far. It's new. Again, it's only had a partial test. We cannot really, if something's only gone through a couple of council districts, you cannot definitively say it's working, it's not working, or what are the side effects. Because the city had a different goal, and not that it was rejecting the other goals, but it was adding this other important goal about bringing in new small donors. CFI, my organization, decided to make this a focus of a lot of its research. We suspected, as the council member had said earlier, that this could really have a transformative effect on the system, not simply about money, but through parlaying candidates' recruitment of small donors in the district and converting them into volunteering and so forth. So we looked at it. We did a number of studies, many of them published in peer-reviewed journals. We did find strong effects when we looked at the city comparing it to itself over time. But in order, again, to have a really good, serious test, it was valuable to have more than 1 city, which wasn't possible until 2013, until 2011, rather. And so Los Angeles joined, I said 2013, it's really 2011 and 13 were the years of the election. And so we did this next article that compared New York City to Los Angeles. And we did a fairly sophisticated differences in differences test. I'll give you just one of the many graphs we put in there to give you a flavor of it. In order to control for the fact, it could be that contributions from small donors go up just because the economy gets better. Or it could be that people care more about city council more than they care about state legislature. You need to be able to control for differences across jurisdictions if you're going to make a serious test. And the way we did it is we looked at donors to city council races compared to state legislative races covering the same geographic area. And we looked at census block groups, which is much smaller than zip code, so you get much more refined analysis. And what counts is the absolute number higher. What counts is, did the difference between, it's called difference in differences, did the difference between city council and state legislature change after legislative reforms? And the answer was yes in New York City. The gap widened. No in Los Angeles. The gap did not widen. Similar looking programs. Hello. Now, other parts of the research went further. The impact is not only on the numbers of small donors, the donors have also been more representative. The following table compares small donors in city council elections with other jurisdictions and other offices. In this table, you're measuring what are census block groups with small donors, how do they compare to the city as a whole? And if you're at 100%, it means you're exactly representative. If you're 110%, it means that you're higher than the city as a whole, and so forth. So basically, in New York City, almost everywhere you have small donors. That's just not true in most other jurisdictions, in most other races.
I have about 1 minute remaining.
I got a lot more to go. I mean, if you're not interested, that's fine. But, seriously.
Okay.
What this tells you is that in New York City, small donors almost perfectly match CBGs, perfectly match the city in income, poverty level, racial composition. Not true in other jurisdictions, not true for other offices. Bottom line of the article, New York City program was effective in city council races and increasing small donors, number, proportional importance, and demographic diversity. Not true for Los Angeles, but also not true for citywide races in either city. I didn't bother showing you that. The mayor is very different. The important point for your job is that the differences in results seem partly connected to very detailed decisions about program design. You can't just say, what if I did this to one aspect of the program without looking at its interactions with all the others? Now I want to get to say, I'll say more about program design later, but I want to get to 2017. Fact about 2017 is that small donor numbers took a major step downward in 2017. Our article took you through 2013. Here's what happened in 2017. Look at the red numbers. Percent of money from small donors, private money only, city council candidates, 29%. This is even lower than before you had multiple matching. Take this seriously. This is a big drop. Now, can I tell you exactly what the causes are? No, but the number is striking. In addition, when you compare mayor, we'll go back here. No, this one doesn't give you mayor. If you compare mayor to other citywide elections, yeah, no matter, in every election, the percent of money from small donors going to mayoral candidates is way lower than for city council, even lower than about half the number for city council in 2017. So, two major sets of conclusions. One, mayors compared to city council, small donors are less important to mayoral candidates, both cities, all years. Mayoral donors show less geographic, demographic diversity in both cities. Mayor and city councils in both cities rely more on small donors than state assembly. City Council, major drop in 2013 to 17, but still double the mayor. Explanations and recommendations to come in the second panel. But those are big findings.
Thank you very much. I see a hand over there. Larian?
Thanks. Do you think that the lack of response or the lack of impact in a place like Los Angeles, or the difference in impact between LA and New York, has anything to do with either voters becoming accustomed to having matching funds? So if it's very new in a city, it may not have kind of sunk on down to the level of the voter. And I guess the other thing would be, is there a tipping point, you think, in terms of how much of a public match there is? I mean, 6-to-1 is quite substantial. Perhaps 1-to-1 doesn't seem like that much. I mean, you're giving $10, it's worth 20. You're giving $10, this gets you 60 more. It's a bit different. And I guess my last question is, for the drop in council elections, is it incumbency? I mean, at a certain point, you just assume the incumbent's going to win, or perhaps you want the incumbent to win and there's less incentive to invest your money.
If I forget one of the three parts, remind me. One, yes, I do think there's an acculturation effect. I do think that it becomes part of the culture when candidates use the incentive to activate their citizens. However, understand that the real effect is not directly on donors. That's not the way this thing works. The real effect is on mobilizers. It's on whether the candidate perceives it to be worth it to spend his or her time mobilizing people in the district to give small contributions. People don't, there's experimental research in this. The 2-to-1, 4-to-1, this doesn't make a difference if you go directly to the donors in an experiment. It does work because contributions require people to be asked. Now, we did not find a big difference between the 4-to-1 to 6-to-1 match. We did find a big difference between 1-to-1 to either 4 or 6. Would it make a difference if you went to 10? I don't know. I suspect yes. But again, I suspect it because what's going on is the key thing you're trying to estimate, and there's no hard science for this, is what will motivate the candidate. And that interplays with contribution limits, it interplays with spending limits, it interplays with fears of independent expenditures. And I will get to all of that in the other part. Did I get all three parts of your question? When you looked at incumbents one year and incumbents another year, non-incumbents one year, non-incumbents another year, there was a drop in the percentage of money raised by incumbents. So it wasn't only that there were more incumbents, it's that when you controlled for incumbency, there was still a drop.
Wendy?
On the same, did you look at independent expenditures from one year to another and whether there was a difference in them, and did you explore whether that accounted for any of these differences?
Sorry. No, I did not study independent expenditures in the city in both years.
John?
So I hear your admonition that small changes in program design can have big impacts. The corollary of that is something that's always true in public policy, which is changes will have unintended consequences. If we change the matching level from 6-to-1 and increase it, will that have an impact in other jurisdictions where you do work or you follow the advocacy efforts, where people who are trying to get matching systems like ours will run up against, well, they did that in New York and they had to go raise it and they had to go spend more public money. So if we make it a richer match, will we be undermining advocates in other cities who are trying to get systems, who are trying to inaugurate systems along the line of ours?
Yeah. First, on the unintended consequences. I think what you need to be concerned about is not just any one element of the system. When I talk about detail, it's the way the details interact. It's the way limits interact with, and I will speak directly to this in the recommendations piece. Might increase, this other point, the cost point, I will also speak to, but I will take the opportunity to respond on this one. Might people flinch if they saw that you had to go up to 10 to 1? Answer is, at 10 to 1 or whatever, the cost is still, from my perspective, although not from tabloids' perspectives, from my perspective, you're still talking small change. It's really cheap to run this program compared to giving one zoning variance to one big donor.
And I would just add, from the tabloid perspective, it doesn't matter how small the match is. It can be a very big headline. So I hear what you're saying. It doesn't matter much in terms of bad publicity, because you'll get it.
Thank you so much for coming in this afternoon. I just have a question. It wasn't something that you addressed in your comments, so this may be something you've encountered in your research. It might not be, but is there any research out there, or are you aware of any that finds any kind of linkage between the percentage or the number of donations that contributions, I'm sorry, that candidates are receiving from smaller donors as opposed to larger ones? The relationship between that and the confidence in elections or appearance of corruption or mistrust of the system? I mean, I think anecdotally we probably have a gut instinct there, but I'm just wondering about what kind of empirical evidence may be out there that you might be aware of.
Short answer, no. There's too many intervening variables. So there's a lot of bad research that says no. For example, hey, we have had contribution limits at the federal level since 1974, and confidence in government has gone down. Yeah, couple of wars, couple of recessions. There's too much else going on, and no, the research is not good.
I mean, if I can answer your question from him, we did do and this is not exactly on point, but we did do research with CUNY to analyze whether people were more likely to vote if they were contributors. And our analysis came out that contributors were 3 times more likely to vote. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have more confidence in government, but it does mean that they're more civically active.
Yeah, I mean, I think voters are more likely to contribute. That is, as you said earlier, correlation and causation is that. However, there's strong reason to believe that, see, voting is on the low end of the participation scale. There's reason to believe that activating people to give $10, this is what the council member Machaka was saying, that it does get people to activate volunteering, which indirectly gets turnout working. But it's more complex than the one.
Let me give my thanks to the panel. It's been very instructive. I know some of you are going to stick around and be on the next panel. But again, my thanks, and the members of the next panel, get ready.
You want a break? Is there a...
I need to get something from my...
We kind of...
I'll be right back.
Do we have a minute between the panels? Chair, do we have a minute between the panels? We're going directly?
Yeah. I just need a minute. I'll be right back. You can start.
Just 2 things that
this is all the testimony about 2012. It's not that important, just in case you're wondering if there's ours. I wouldn't really refer to this, but just in case. This is their campaign finances testimony from 2012, and it has really explicit examples of coordination. So they have local teams, example coordination first communication. You can refer to these examples from Annabelle Palm's 2003 campaign, and you just bullet point examples of how it was too close to be considered just communication. This is from the campaign finance board, not from us.
Sorry, I don't know if this comes within your job description. Thanks a lot. Very cutting edge, Rick. It enables you to look up something instead of looking at I always feel like people pay more attention when you don't read, when you just summarize, but harder to do, obviously. How are you? Good. I guess I'm ready. I guess if I can talk back to somebody telling me what time it is, I guess it means I'm ready. It's just me snorking, and thanks a lot.
Have you ever sat on a commission, or you've just staffed on it?
Correct. Yeah, I've never seen it. Okay, thanks.
Let me begin by making some overall announcements. The Brooklyn Borough President, Eric Adams, is slated to be on this panel, but he has been delayed, so we will proceed without him. I know he's got a very busy schedule, so I may call on him next when he does, in fact, arrive. With that, let me indicate that this, as opposed to panel one, is focused on actual proposals for campaign finance reform. And let me run through the list of panelists. Alex Camarada from reInvent Albany, Rachel Bloom from the Citizens Union, Frederick Schaefer and Amy Lopez from the Campaign Finance Board. I indicated the Borough President of Brooklyn will hopefully join us, and we will still have Professor Michael Malbin, Campaign Finance Institute, and I hope you're not offended because we are going to try to keep folks to their schedule. This is, we're running tight again. With that, let me start with Alex Camarada.
Thank you, Chair Perales and members of the Charter Revision Commission. I'm Alex Camarda, a Senior Policy Advisor for reInvent Albany. reInvent Albany advocates for transparency and accountability in state government, and we are leading champions for transparency in New York City government, especially strengthening open data and freedom of information law. I'm going to summarize much of my testimony because of matters of time. So we were asked to comment on three specific proposals the Commission is specifically looking at. One is increasing or eliminating the cap on public matching funds. The second is lowering the campaign contribution limit. And the third is increasing the match rate beyond the 6-to-1 match currently on the first $175 of any campaign contribution. So in short, we support all three of these proposals. We think they should all be done simultaneously. And I would echo what Michael mentioned earlier about a lot of interplay between these three different proposals. We went back and forth internally as to whether we would support some of them solely. First, regarding the cap on public matching funds, as you know from the earlier hearings, there's currently a 55% cap of the spending limit for the office a candidate seeks on the amount of public matching funds they can receive. We think that should be lifted entirely, which effectively raises it to 86% of the spending limit for the office. The reason it's not 100% is 1/7 of the money under the current public match rate would be from private funds, or 14%. There's a Kalos bill in the City Council that he testified to this commission about. It was introduced before the last council and also this council. It has quite a bit of support that would lift the public match cap altogether. As part of advocacy for that bill, we did put out some data with Represent Us New York about fundraising by council members. It echoes some of the data that Michael presented. It's a little bit different because we only looked at the candidates who won, namely the council members who are currently in office. And we looked at the base amount of the contribution, not the allocation of the public matching portion. So if you look at page 2 of my testimony, you'll see that council members currently in office raise an overwhelming portion of their funds from what we call larger contributions, the amount above $175. And we have it at 88% of the money that they raise comes from contributions larger than $175. Even when we looked at the thresholds for $500 and $1,000, you can still see when looking at the dollar value, it's quite high. Now, in the appendix of my testimony, you can see a breakdown for each individual council member. You'll also note that there's a second chart in the second to last page of my testimony in the appendix that shows that when you look at it by contribution, council members raise a majority of their contributions from small donations. But when you look at it in dollar terms, that's where you see these stark differences. Michael's number was 29%. The reason there's a difference, I believe, is because he was looking at all candidates, not just the ones who won, and also because he was looking at how the public match portion was allocated. I think it's notable that for the public match portion, the match is provided not just to small contributions up to $175, but also any contribution. And so we support actually eliminating the match for the amount above $175, which would also save the city millions of dollars. I also wanted to note on the public match cap that looking at the 2013 races for both city council and mayor, so 168 candidates ran for city council in 2013. 51 of those candidates hit the public match cap. That's 30% during the primary election. In the general election, 15 candidates did. So I think that points to the need to lift the public match cap, particularly for city council, and to lift it significantly because you have 30% of the candidates actually hitting it for the primary election. For the mayoral election, Kalos put out data that showed that 49% of the funds raised for city council came from the largest contribution possible, which was $4,950. Now it's $5,000. And that just 5% of the funds came from contributions of $175 or less. So it really is important for citywide races to incentivize small dollar fundraising, but also important, I think, for the city council, at least based on the data from the last election. On lifting the size of the contribution limits, we recommend lowering the contribution limits by 50%. On page 4 of my testimony,
Alex, about 2 minutes left.
Okay. I provided some comparisons to other localities. New York City contribution limits, much to our chagrin as advocates, are actually not all that much higher than other places. They are significantly higher than Los Angeles. They're actually lower than Chicago. And looking at New York City, if you believe New York City is more like a state because of its size, we found, looking at contribution limits for individuals for state legislatures, the median for governor was $3,800. We have a higher, roughly similar limit for for mayor and citywides, and the median was 1,000 for state senate and state house. The caveat there is, depending on the place, the contribution limit, it could be per year, it could be per election, or it could be per election cycle. So the comparisons are a bit difficult. But generally speaking, New York City's contribution limits seem roughly comparable to other places, but generally speaking, across the country, contribution limits are pretty high, particularly when you think about people who make contributions. I think Michael's presented data previously. Over 98% of the people in the city do not give any campaign contributions. The median household income is $58,856. So really, when you look at people who give contributions, particularly large ones, it's a very select group of people. It tends to be older white males. Obviously, their voice should count, but what the purpose of the city system is really to make sure everybody's voice counts. And clearly, we need to elevate those who have less money, in our view. As far as the last proposal we were asked to comment on, which is increasing the size of the 6-to-1 match, we heard history as to how it's gone up over time. We looked for data to support that making a difference. We did not find a lot. We found that in 2009, the number of first-time contributors did go up from 28,170 to 33,900 when the match was raised from 2-to-1 to 4-to-1, I believe. Or I'm sorry, from 4-to-1 to 6-to-1. And the proportion of first-time contributors giving small contributions also went up at that time from 68.7 to 83%. I think an interesting place to look at, although relatively new reforms, is Montgomery, Maryland. They have a tiered public matching rate. So the way it works is the public match actually is larger for smaller contributions, and it phases out as the contribution increases in size.
I think your time is up, Mr. Camarada. Let me ask a quick question because it relates to something you said. And I think Professor Malbin also made reference to it, which is the interplay between the changes, the fact that you've got to look at the entire design of the system. One of the things that I'm interested in, I've asked this question before, whether or not increasing the match basically will bring in many more candidates. I just have a sense, instinctively, that I assume that is true. Has anyone studied that? Has there been any? Is there any evidence to suggest that if you raise the match from 6-to-1 to 7-to-1 or to 10-to-1, whether or not it's going to have a real impact on the number of candidates?
The only peer-reviewed work on the impact of public financing looks at the full public financing, and the answer is yes, it did have an effect, a positive effect on candidate emergence. There's been no comparable studies for looking at matching rates.
If I could just add, I think our concern is that we want candidates to have the biggest pool of donors possible. We don't want to see a narrowing of the pool. And so when you increase the match rate, I mean, I just did this back of the envelope for City Council. If you keep the same spending limit, it would reduce the number of contributions, small contributions that they would need to raise from 180 to 135. So that's not necessarily a positive thing to have fewer contributors. The idea would be you want a candidate to have a broader set of contributors.
But did you, back of the envelope, indicate what happens if you bring in more candidates?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I was just looking at it from
the
perspective of one candidate and their donors.
One of the hard reason this is hard to analyze in New York City is because it's hard to parse out the effects of term limits and the interplay of having an incumbent running it for an office versus insurgents. So when we try, when we look at, there are a large number of candidates running always, but when there's an open seat, there's generally more candidates. So it's hard to parse out the effect of the matching rate versus, the effect of the term limits.
Just one question on that. Would that be would that be addressed or helped by increasing the spending limit, and what would your view be on that?
Well, in the context of the three proposals that we were asked to comment on, we thought lifting the public match cap would address the fact that you're also narrowing the donor pool potentially by lowering or by increasing the match rate. But yes, you could also increase the spending limit. I don't know that we would recommend that.
Oh, I got that. Okay. So, Alex, just so I am clear on what you're saying that you're not recommending an increase in the matching. But in the previous panel, we heard some pretty compelling arguments for suggesting that the matching has been very effective in increasing the kinds of candidates, the diversity of candidates. So you're saying, are you saying that it works as is, the matching piece, but you are recommending that the limit be lowered?
So we support increasing the public match rate from 6 to 1. We didn't specify what it should be raised to. We think that in addition for the three reforms that were mentioned, that contributions above 175, which is currently the case, are matched. We don't think that those contributions should be matched. We think we should incentivize small donor giving, and the best way to do that is to only match the amount up to 175 and not the first 175 of a $5,000 contribution, for example.
Let's move on to Rachel Bloom.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Perales and members of the Charter Revision Commission. My name is Rachel Bloom, and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Programs at Citizens Union. Thank you so much for having the opportunity to share our recommendations on campaign finance with you today. Over the last 3 decades, New York City's campaign finance program has positioned itself at the forefront of efforts to empower the electorate in the face of ever-increasing influence of big money in political campaigning. It is acclaimed throughout the country as a groundbreaking model of how a municipal campaign finance system can transform elections and bring about a much more diverse range of candidates. The following are our thoughts, concerns, and recommendations for the Commission to consider on the subject of campaign finance. And I will note that, much like Alex, I imagine I won't get through all of it, but I did bring copies and leave them at the desk for all of you. I don't know if you have them in front of you. So the first thing, the issue of increasing public funds for candidates. Citizens Union is neutral on the issue of increasing public funds given to candidates. However, if the Commission chooses to do so, we note some concerns regarding the potential impact that we wanted to highlight for
Could you just clarify something for me? Are you talking about increasing the match or just overall?
Increasing the public match, yeah. The first concern we have is qualified expenditures. Matching funds from the Campaign Finance Board can only be used for qualified expenditures as dictated by law. So matching funds cannot be used, for instance, in advance of the calendar year of an election, to pay family members, or for ballot litigation. The more a candidate receives in matching funds, the less they will be able to be spent on unqualified expenditures. The other thing we wanted to raise is documentation requirements. A candidate relying upon the CFB for matching funds is required to keep detailed receipts of all of their expenses and to submit them for review. Candidates must maintain and may be required to produce these copies of checks, bills, and other documentation, and which obviously makes sense for public money. But Citizens Union has concerns that if the amount of matching funds rise, so will the justifiably heavy burden of submitting all required paperwork to the CFB. And if you have ever attended a hearing about the from people who have run and gone through the system, this is something you hear a lot of treasurers talking about, the paperwork and how burdensome it is. So the more we increase the match, that's something also that we need to be keeping aware of. Second thing we wanted to highlight is that we support prohibiting public funds for consultants that also lobby. Citizens Union believes that participants in the city's campaign finance program should be banned from using public matching funds to purchase strategic campaign consulting services from firms that also lobby. While we do not take the position that campaigns cannot hire these lobbyists, we do believe that public funds should not be allowed for this purpose. We are concerned about the possibility of lobbyists having undue influence with the politicians they may have helped to elect. So that is our second proposal. Another thing that we wanted to focus on is improving laws regulating elected officials' nonprofits. In the end of 2016, Local Law 181 brought nonprofits that are affiliated with elected officials under certain campaign finance regulations, closely regulating a proposal put forward by Citizens Union. We believe that the council missed some key opportunities to ensure that organizations under the influence of an elected official are appropriately regulated to prevent the circumvention of campaign finance rules or the appearance thereof. Under current law, an organization affiliated with an elected official is defined as an entity for which the official or their agent is the principal officer with control over the organization, or which was created by the official or the agent in recent years. This definition is, by our belief, too narrow. To properly determine whether an official controls an organization or whether it is independent, we recommend that additional factors be considered, including whether the official's political operation and the organization do things like share office space, resources, consultants, whether the organization sponsors programs primarily featuring the official, and whether the organization has directors or managers with close ties to the official. The law does, however, leave open the possibility for the Conflict of Interest Board to develop criteria to define control in such a way. And so that is another one of our recommendations.
Rachel, about 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Thanks.
Okay. Briefly, I'm not going to go into detail. We have much greater detail in our written testimony. I know at different hearings, union representatives have supported altering laws regarding campaign coordination between unions. We support subjecting candidate coordination, but not communication, with union members to campaign finance regulations. We believe communications between an organization and its members should not be impeded in any way when those communications are not coordinated with a candidate. But when a candidate directs the union to act as an arm of his or her campaign and conduct its campaign work, we believe this must be considered a direct in-kind contribution and should be regulated under the city's campaign finance laws. Our last 2 points, very quickly. We support enacting war chest restrictions. And finally, we support transferring lobbying, reporting, and enforcement to the Campaign Finance Board. We are concerned that the city clerk is responsible for lobbying oversight and enforcement when that position is held by someone who is appointed by the city council, the very entity of which lobbying of officials occurs. We believe this is a conflict of interest that must be removed, and that the CFB is uniquely positioned to take on this oversight role. We recommend that lobbying and reporting responsibilities are transferred from the city clerk's office to the Campaign Finance Board to create a more independent and effective system of lobbying law enforcement, and that the CFB be given sufficient resources to take on these new responsibilities. We thank you today for the opportunity to share our thoughts, and we look forward to the continued work of the Commission in assisting and making changes in the form and function of our city government. Thank you.
2 questions. First, the proposal to restrict payments to consultants who also lobby and in terms of qualified expenditures sounds great. I can imagine a lot of people advocating for that. Have you given thought to the details? For instance, how could you do that? How could you have an impact on a campaign consultant who, after an election, registers to lobby? Is the proposal that qualified matching funds could not be paid to people who had previously lobbied? Or would it be forward-looking, and if so, how could that work?
I think, with everything, the devil is in the details. I think as it stands, we were sort of just thinking about people who engage in both at the same time, which is a lot of agencies. We can't, what someone does in the future is sort of not something that we can control. I imagine you could put a time limit, perhaps, on their ability to lobby, but we're sort of at this moment talking about people who are engaging in both simultaneously.
Second question, really not to you, but to others on the panel. Does the CFB want to be in the business of doing lobbyist regulation?
Are you talking about that proposal? proposal or the proposal about the moving the lobbying?
Moving the lobbying, but also if you have views on this, because I mean, both.
As far as the latter, about moving the lobbying, I mean, obviously, the ideas of an independent regulatory, I mean, that's what we do. We're an independent body, so we don't really have a particular opinion about that. I mean, if the idea is that Citizens Union is making a recommendation that an independent organization deal with the administration of lobbying registration, we are an independent organization. Whether or not that makes us uniquely able to do that, I leave it to you to decide. On the other provision, I share some of the issues about knowing who is lobbying, and some of the devil would be in the details about making expenditures to firms that do both lobbying and campaign consulting, might be difficult to implement, but we'd have to look into that more closely.
This is very loud. I'm wondering if you. Sorry. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on your proposal regarding the member-to-member communications for unions and how to separate between coordinated activity and communications with members, and how you would address individual members volunteering for campaigns in that as well.
So, I mean, we took a look at the current law, which under section 3-716, a candidate is allowed to appear before members at union-sponsored event as long as they are not fundraisers. We think the current provisions provide the proper balance between allowing organizations to communicate freely with their members, recognizing their First Amendment rights to free speech, ensuring that candidates do not receive unlimited in-kind donations from large membership organizations. I think there had been proposals to you at several of the hearings that this be changed. We are sort of more saying we support the law as it is. I wasn't sure if there was going to be someone testifying today to change it, and so that's why we wanted to be sure to include those provisions.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. We will now move on to Frederick Schaefer. Is Amy going to say anything, or is he talking for you?
Help answer questions.
You help answer question. All right, I got it.
Chair Perales, members of the Commission, thank you for inviting us to share our policy proposals with you today. As you know, after each election cycle, the CFB conducts a review of our programs and proposes changes as required by the Campaign Finance Act. This regular review has ensured that changes have been made with each election cycle to strengthen the program, further amplify the voices of small contributors, and update it so it remains relevant with an ever-changing election landscape. The Matching Funds program has been successful here in New York City, with established candidates and first-time challengers alike, relying on the program to help them build competitive campaigns for office. As described in our earlier presentation, our analysis shows that the program decreases candidates' reliance on big money contributions while helping to develop a broad, diverse base of small donor contributors in every neighborhood across the city. In order to further increase the impact of New Yorkers' small contributions to candidates, the board has the following recommendations. We believe that enhancements to the program can ensure that the impact of small dollar contributions is felt as clearly in elections for citywide offices as it is in the city council races. We all have an interest in making sure the voices of regular New Yorkers are heard in City Hall, and therefore we have 5 recommendations that we believe will make the program work better for all city offices and further reduce the influence of big money in New York City. First, lowering the contribution limits. We recommend lowering the contribution limit from $5,100 to $2,250 for citywide offices, from $2,950 to $1,750 for borough offices, and from $2,850 to $1,250 for city council seats. Lowering contribution limits across the board will help small dollar contributors play an even larger role in city campaigns. The majority of those who gave a contribution in the 2017 mayoral race were small contributors. Overall, 73% of those contributing to mayoral hopefuls gave $175 or less. Over 13,000 people gave small contributions to participating mayoral candidates in the last election cycle, compared to only 650 people who gave a maximum contribution of $4,950. However, those maximum contributions made up 45% of the private fundraising of mayoral candidates before accounting for public funds, even though there were nearly 21 times the number of small contributors as large donors. Given the demands of raising a large amount of money to run for mayor and other citywide offices, it is no wonder that candidates feel it is most effective to pursue the largest contributions to fund their campaigns. Amplifying the voices of small contributors needs to start with cutting the contribution limit to increase the power of those without deep pockets or wealthy friends. 2, increase the matching formula for citywide offices. To increase the value of public funds and further amplify the voices of small contributors, the matching rate for citywide candidates should be increased from 6-to-1 to 8-to-1. This should be coupled with a maximum matchable amount, an increase from $175 to $250 for those offices. Our analysis shows that these two proposals in combination will change the balance of private to public funds for citywide offices, making them more like the city council races. Increasing the matching rate along with lowering the contribution limit will significantly increase the impact of small dollar contributions. In fact, during the past 3 citywide elections, the median public funds payment to city council candidates was 53% of the spending limit. In other words, just shy of the 55% payment cap. In other words, it was working pretty well. Conversely, the median public funds payment to participating mayoral candidates was just 28% of the spending limit. Even mayoral candidates who pursued strong, small dollar fundraising strategies were far less reliant on public funds than city council candidates. Third, increase the public funds cap. We propose increasing the amount of public funds that campaigns can receive by increasing the public funds cap from 55% to 65%. A candidate for city council would have to raise $17,417 in matchable contributions in order to receive the maximum of $104,500 in public funds. That candidate would then need to raise $68,083 in private funds to hit the spending limit for city council races. This modest increase of public funds cap from 55 to 65% would allow candidates to increase their reliance on small dollar contributions and public funds. At the same time, it would also allow candidates some flexibility to raise and spend private funds in advance of receiving the matching funds.
Rick, we have about 2 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Under the Campaign Finance Act, most public funds are paid only after the ballot is finalized, which is a little more than a month before the election. Many candidates, particularly for citywide offices, begin campaigning well in advance of this time frame and need to be able to spend funds prior to when public funds payments are made. In conjunction with the lower contribution limit and increased matching formula, this will help create a more inclusive, effective program for citywide candidates. Under the current system, candidates for citywide office virtually never qualify enough contributions to reach the 55% public funds cap that is available to them. Based on our analysis, changing the matching rate would increase the amount of public funds going to citywide campaigns, making it more likely that they will receive the maximum amount of public funds available to them, even if we lifted the cap to 65%. Under this proposed system, citywide candidates could run competitive campaigns primarily funded by small dollar contributions. Our last 2 proposals I'll just deal with very briefly since my time is almost up. One is to lower the thresholds for citywide candidates, to empower more small dollar fundraisers, to run viable competitive campaigns for city office. We support lowering the threshold for participating candidates running for citywide office. In order to qualify for public funds, candidates in the program currently must meet a two-part fundraising threshold. Mayoral candidates must raise $250,000 in matching claims, with 1,000 contributors giving at least $10, while candidates for public advocate and controller must raise $125,000 with 500 contributors giving at least $10. Lowering the threshold for citywide offices would make it easier for grassroots candidates to meet thresholds earlier and run viable campaigns. We propose thresholds of $125,000 for mayor and $75,000 for public advocate. But in order to ensure that candidates running for citywide office are reaching out to voters across New York City and to maintain the rigor of lower thresholds, we propose adding a new geographic requirement. In addition to meeting this two-part threshold, candidates for any citywide office must collect at least 50 contributions from each borough to qualify for public funds. And finally, we would propose lowering the minimum contribution counting towards the threshold from $10 to $5. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I've actually two questions. The first has to do with when these new rules would go into effect. You know, we here would be putting before the voters in November these changes that we'd advocate to the charter. How would this affect the 2021 election? I suspect there are people already raising funds.
I think our proposal is that it would go into effect immediately.
Therefore?
I mean, there are candidates already running for the 2020
Exactly.
election, but there have been changes in the law later in the election cycle, you know, that have been able to be accommodated. So I think that the recommendation would be that they would go into effect for the 2021 election cycle.
I mean, when we're in the out-year period, as we are, it makes it a lot easier to do this than obviously if we were closer to the election date.
All right. The other question, a little bit more vague, because we keep hearing, we as commissioners, that you make one change here, it's going to have an impact on the other part of the election scheme. And have you run numbers so that you can be confident that your proposals will result in about the same amount of total money that can be spent by the candidate?
Well, I'm going to let Amy answer the details, but on the general level, we're not proposing any increase in the expenditure limits.
Exactly. That's what I was wondering.
And what we're trying to do with the first three proposals, and they really do mesh together, is to say if you lower the contribution limit, as we're proposing, by more than half, we've tried to structure the second and third proposals so that roughly that same amount of money comes back into the system through public funds in a way that is consistent with the goal of encouraging small donor contributions. And so, yes, we have run those numbers so that those three proposals, we think, work together in total. Maybe, did you want to add anything?
No, and that's exactly what we did. That's how we came up with these numbers.
Thank you again for your testimony this afternoon. So my question is, relates to, I mean, the 5 proposals that you've set forth, they would all, the current contribution limits, the current match amounts, those are all set forth currently in the administrative code. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, just for the transcript. So I guess my question is, you know, do you have views about how appropriate it would be to, you know, set these numbers into the city charter, which is something that is, I mean, because these proposals, or some version of them, I don't know about the precise numbers, I'm nowhere near as steeped in this as you are, but they all seem to have some intuitive appeal. But my question is whether it makes sense for them to be instantiated in the city charter, which, as you can see from all of this machinery here, it's quite difficult to amend. If it turns out that the numbers should change over time, maybe the limits need to be reduced even more, maybe the match numbers need to go up even higher, maybe we miscalibrate something and we need to adjust something. If these changes are in the city charter, that kind of ties the hands of the city in a way that if they're in the code, maybe they're a little bit easier to adjust. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
I believe, but it's been a long time since I was in the Corporation Counsel's office, that city charter provisions can be amended by the city council, just like ordinary legislation.
That is also my belief.
You know, we at some level we give the charter, we put it on a higher pedestal, but for purposes of municipal law, it's really just another statute.
Thanks.
So I have a few questions. The first is you recommend increasing the public funds cap just to 65%. Others have asked for it to be raised to 85%. I'm wondering if you can comment on the proposals to raise it even higher and why you did not make that recommendation. And then I have questions about independent expenditures.
Well, part of it is a practical reality. If you raise it to 85%, I don't think anybody could ever actually spend it anyway, because of the limited period of time in which you've got to make expenditures and the fact that you need to start spending before you get the money. On top of that, any prudent campaign is going to think about the necessary expenditures that are not eligible for a match and figure a cushion in to take care of those which can be spent. They're legal and expenses, they're just not eligible for a match. And so when you take those two things into account, it means you're never really going to reach the 85% anyway. And so our proposal it really is designed to take the burden of that risk off of the candidate and say, okay, let's move it up in a way that accomplishes what Kalos's proposal tries to accomplish to a large degree. But let's also recognize that it would be unlikely and probably imprudent for any candidate to push too close to 85% anyway.
And before I ask my next question, did you want to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, so in the interest of finding common ground here for the commission, I think for the citywide races, 65% is plenty because the citywide candidates don't often hit the cap. Our concern would be for city council because, as I mentioned, 30% of the candidates in 2013 actually hit the cap. So if you're only increasing it by from 55 to 65%, that's 10%. 10% of 104,000, 10,400. That's like 10 contributions.
Well,
with
but
the
we're
public
also
match,
raising
so that's not much.
The maximum we would propose raising the maximum matchable contribution from 175 to 250. So I think that also needs to be factored in.
I mean, just for absolute clarity for those who are not well steeped in the whole, exactly how the election calendar works, we make public funds payments to candidates who are on the ballot and or opposed on the ballot. Therefore, we can only make those payments once the ballot has been set. That is set in state election law, and candidates file their petitions, the Board of Elections has their hearings, the ballot is set roughly at the end of July, beginning of August, which means that we make our first public funds payments in the beginning of August, which leaves about 5 weeks before the primary for the candidates to spend these public funds. And that's the timing issue that we're talking about. To spend 85% of your spending limit in that 5 weeks is quite difficult. There is a new law that allows, we're making small seed payments earlier in June, but that's only $10,000 for a city council candidate, $250,000 for a mayoral candidate. So again, you're talking about spending the bulk of your money in that period of time, and you have to spend money earlier. I mean, outside of that, you know, you're getting ready, you're communicating, you're raising money. There's lots of things to spend money on before that that you wouldn't have public funds for. And again, there is the issue of, you know, making sure that people document that they've spent the money appropriately, and this 65% creates a balance that makes it, you know, not an undue burden to be able to meet those documentation requirements.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question was on independent expenditures. There are no proposals that you have from the Campaign Finance Board relating to them, and I was just wondering if you have seen a problem of increased independent expenditures, and if you had any proposals also that you wanted to make regarding sort of strengthening the independent expenditure disclosure requirements.
I think our position is that they've worked pretty well. There have been some fluctuations, some ups and downs, depending on the election cycle as to how much has come in, how much has been spent through independent expenditures, but we think overall it's been more or less under control, and our primary concern right now is that it not be weakened. We don't see a particular need to strengthen it at this time.
I have several. First of all, our charge is to increase democracy. There are multiple democratic values at stake here. Increasing the role of small donors is only one. One of the great values of the campaign finance system, it seems to me, over the last 20 years is that it has enabled quality candidates, experienced candidates, candidates from previously less represented communities to run, but it only works if they can run effectively. The reason, clearly, that mayoral candidates rely more on big contributions is because it takes a lot of money to run an effective mayoral campaign. And while it sounds good and feels good to say, let's lower the contribution limit, that is going to have consequences. Candidates are going to have to work way harder to raise money. They're going to have to spend a lot more time raising money. And we haven't had situations under the campaign finance system where qualified, capable, well-known candidates have not had the funds to run effectively. But if we make fundraising that much harder, we may. I don't know too many people who have run citywide, particularly for mayor, who think that lowering the contribution limit is a good idea. And any regulatory body needs to listen to the expertise of the people they're regulating and consider that. So the question is, have you really thought through how this is going to change the way campaigns actually function? Because there is an efficiency to getting on the phone and getting 500 people to give $4,500 or $5,100 that is going to be lost here. So I'm interested in your views on that.
I completely agree with what you just said, and if our only proposal were to decrease the contribution limit, I would have the exact same concerns. After all, just to use round numbers so the arithmetic works well, if you decrease the contribution limit from $5,000 to $2,500 and make a mayoral candidate just go get twice as many of those contributions, we haven't really accomplished very much. That's why we want to increase the match for citywide officials from 6-to-1 to 8-to-1 and increase the matchable amount from $175 to $250. We crunched those numbers precisely with this problem in mind, and we think that the overall effect of those three things together meets the concern that you have just expressed and that I would have as well.
And has that empirical analysis been submitted to us? Do we have access to see what the scenarios look like and what these changes would do based on prior experiences?
Well, we haven't submitted that, but I mean, what you could see from Eric's, the J-shaped charts that he showed earlier, is that candidates are, even citywide candidates, are raising large numbers of small dollar contributions. So they are already, you can see that just changing the math does change the total amount of money they're going to get. So it, we can work on submitting something about this particular analysis, but I'm just, just from what you already have before you, you can see that candidates are already reaching out to small citywide.
No, I understand, Amy, but the question is what would be you have to raise X dollars to run an effective campaign. And with these changes, if you model them based on prior experiences, what would the budgets look like? And would the increase in the matching ratio really offset the decrease in the cap?
It's our belief it would not only offset it, but it would then also increase the percentage of public funds that mayoral candidates, percentage of their total expenditures, up closer to what the number is for city council. And if you would like to see a more detailed analysis, we'd be happy to provide it.
We'll talk about that and follow up. Second question, and this frankly from a users or candidates perspective, because I've already heard a lot about this, I imagine other members of the commission have, which is the implementation. Are you proposing to implement these retroactively? These changes? Particularly with respect to the contribution limit?
But by retroactively, I mean, if it's prospective starting at the date of passage, are you defining that as retroactive because some money has already been raised?
Well, let me be more specific. Are you proposing that candidates who in 2018, have raised $5,100 that they have to refund a portion of those contributions to get under the new cap?
I mean, I can tell you that in the past, the contribution limit has changed. The corporate contribution ban went into effect, and all of those changes were done prospectively. So in 1998, the contribution limit went down substantially from the previous election cycles. So I think that there's no difficulty in saying that the contribution limit reduction would be a prospective, so that if you have contributions that are over $5,100 or within the limit by the date that it's passed, those are fine. But then going forward, you'd have to abide by the lower contribution limit. And since no public funds have been apply the matching to all the public funds that you get paid in the election with a higher matching rate.
And likewise, are you proposing that it would be prospective so that candidates who in the 2017 cycle raised but didn't spend money and transfer it forward into this cycle would be able to keep the money they raised under the old rules?
So people who are transferring, it's a very, very, very granular question.
But we've lived through it.
I have to think about it. I would assume that, I mean, I just don't know how it was treated in the past. I think that in the past, it was all money raised before the date of the passage of the lower contribution limit was allowed, but the transfer, I'm just like...
Okay, so if I hear you right, there conceivably could be candidates running in 2021. There will be candidates running in 2021 who have at different times during this election raised money under different sets of rules, right?
And that's happened in past...
Whether it's happened or not, I mean, I think we're dealing with fundamental fairness, because the message you're sending to the market is if you're thinking of running next time, you should be out raising every dollar you can raise right now, which is somewhat inconsistent with the philosophy and ethos of the system. And also, I mean, it could have very unfair impacts on some candidates. And I'm just raising this directly. It's been raised with me. Our chair raised this in the first instance. I mean, there are real questions of equity and fairness here in the next elections at stake, I think.
Well, just because it's been done in the past doesn't mean that it could not be done. I mean, there have been, candidates have had to refund contributions. Like if you're running in a special election, for example, and you've raised money for the contributions for a regular election, and then there's a special election, candidates have been asked to refund all the contributions that are over limit. You could do it either way. I'm just saying that in the past it's been prospective, but there have been there are examples in the current system where people have been asked to refund money.
I'm just raising the issue because this is something that we're all, and particularly the commission, will have to think through very carefully.
It might be helpful to look at numbers, because the theoretical concern with fairness is certainly an absolutely legitimate concern. If the amount of money raised in the first year of the four-year election cycle is generally sufficiently small that it is not worth the administrative burden of trying to do this retroactively. That might weigh into the decision. But certainly I see your point about fairness.
Well, but we won't even know because we have to make this proposal in September. It'll be on the ballot in November, and you won't know what people are raising this year until the end of your reporting.
No, the first disclosure statement is due in July, so we
Right,
will know.
but what people raise in the second half of whatever year this is.
2018.
2018, we won't know. Two more questions. One is the geographic requirement on the threshold to qualify. This seems to me to be a fundamentally different requirement than we've ever had in the system, right? Campaign finance reform is basically, let's limit, let's regulate what money candidates can raise. It's kind of like money in politics, it's TRAFE. Let's set some rules on what can and can't be done. This is a different proposal. This is affirmatively requiring that candidates go out and raise money in a certain way. And it's 50 contributions in a borough, in each borough for citywide. It seems inconsequential, but I have two concerns. One is, will this open the door to a whole new set of regulations now? We're going to say you have to go raise from this, you have to go raise from this, all these requirements. It's like engineering campaign fundraising, number one. Number two, have you actually looked at how many Republicans raised 50 matching contributions in Bronx, or how many Democrats actually raised 50 contributions in Staten Island? And do we really want to tell candidates that they have to go out and introduce themselves to communities where they have no background and no ties, and the first thing they have to do is go ask for money? That doesn't seem to me like it's getting money out of politics. It seems to me like it's pushing the fundraising race into places for other reasons. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I mean, we're talking about this only in the context of how you qualify.
Which means you have to do it early.
Right. And it's also in the context of significantly reducing, I think it's by half, the dollar amount. And so you're trying to identify people who are reasonably likely to be real candidates. And so we thought the number 50 is really quite minimal, even for a Democrat in Staten Island or a Republican in the Bronx. And we think it's really just limited to this context. This is not intended to be the tip of any iceberg. And if it needed to be fine-tuned a little bit, one could say 4 out of 5 boroughs as well as all 5. But we did think that some geographical distribution in this context, given the lowering of the amount, was appropriate.
It's interesting because I assumed it was to try to remedy the map that Eric puts up that shows that, almost all money now comes from a certain swath of Brooklyn and Manhattan around the park. But what you've just said is do we really have a concern about relatively weak, unqualified, unsupported candidates qualifying in citywide races? Is that really a problem? I'm not sure we've seen that.
I mean, the idea is while we would lower the threshold by a half, we would, add this little additional burden. And the point of that map is that candidates are fundraising all across the city already. And that, that's a truism.
Okay.
While you would, maybe if you put that map up for a state, state offices, you would see a completely different kind of map. So we already, candidates are raising money all across the city, and, all different candidates. And so this is not, but it's, in our analysis, not a particularly burdensome and not meant to be a tip of the iceberg, really meant to say.
John, you've got one more question?
You want to be the mayor for the whole city, you should raise money from the whole city.
I do have one more. Thank you for your patience. So, under the charter, member-to-member organizational contacts, communications are excluded from the definition of independent expenditure. Can you explain what the line is under your regulatory system of where a member-to-member contact crosses a line that converts it into a contribution or an in-kind contribution, and why is that the regulatory line that you've set?
The line is coordination with the candidate, and it's an absolute red line. We simply cannot run this kind of system unless we have a clear and honest reporting of contributions, and the definition of contributions has to include in-kind expenditures made in coordination. Otherwise, you wind up with what's essentially an unenforceable law, which is pretty much what we have at the federal level.
I just wanted to clarify that, is it your testimony that the recommendations that you have proposed would reduce the percentage of overall fundraising that comes from a relatively small number of people without reducing the number of people that contribute and without reducing the overall amount, so as to reduce the appearance and risk of corruption? Is that the effect of your recommendations?
Well, if I haven't understood your question, you're going to correct me, but I think the answer to your question is that our proposals considered as a package will significantly increase the role of public funding, particularly in the citywide campaigns, without changing either the total amount of money or the expenditure limits, and that is a good thing.
Yeah, and it will do so in a way that also can reduce the both risk and appearance of corruption. Is that fair in what part of what you were thinking through in those proposals?
Yes, in both lowering the contribution limit and increasing the amount of funds, that would do both of those things.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me move to Professor Michael Malbin once again.
I'm waiting for the screen. Thank you. Turns out there's a great overlap between my recommendations and the Campaign Finance Board, so I'll be able to be more mindful of time. To just very quickly remind you where we stood at the end of my last one, the system's been effective with respect to city councils on a number of dimensions through 2013. 2017, there appears to have been a sudden change. The system never achieved these kind of results with mayoral or other citywide elections. I'm going to go through things in this order. Not going to read this, that'll waste time, but here's where I am. For mayor and citywide elections, I think you ought to increase the matching fund rate. 8 to 1 seems like a possibility. I think you could look at 10 to 1 for the first 250. I'm not sure what the number should be until we run the scenarios that I think you ought to run and that Mr. Siegel suggested. I will go through that more. I think you should remove the 55% cap on public money. I don't know what purpose that serves. What is your public policy purpose? I don't get it, as long as there's a spending limit. Third, I agree that there ought to be some kind of... It can't be 100% because you're matching a private contribution.
86 is as high as you can get.
Yeah.
So 86 would be the max.
Would be the max, and I think there would be practical problems that the CFB has pointed to, and I think candidates can figure out their own budgets. I think at some point you hit the spending limit and you've raised enough.
I understand you.
Yeah, okay. I would have defined the geographic requirement in terms of council districts rather than boroughs. I would say that we do have an experience of requiring a geographic requirement, and that's the presidential system, where it's 40% of the states. I would reduce the contribution limit. Again, I don't have a specific number in mind. Cutting it at about half seems to make sense. With respect to the city council, where the problem is a new one that appeared in 2017, I think you need to consider increasing the matching fund raise, which is different than saying, yes, increase it. Consider reducing the contribution limit, and again, just do away with this public funding cap as long as you keep the spending limit. Public funding cap is crucial if you don't have a spending limit, but you do have one. For borough-wide, set them somewhere in between the two. Let's not spend time on that. For contribution limits, Alex had an idea that I think what I'm articulating is what he had in mind. You could consider something like the following. Match only contributions from donors whose total aggregate contributions come to no more than X dollars. Let's say match the first 250 if someone gives no more than 500 to a candidate. The overall contribution limit is 2,500 if it's not matched. You could do something like that. It's in several proposals. That would be another way of leveraging the small contributions. The administrative stuff has been figured out and other proposals pending. So that's another idea worth toying with. And again, you need to work out what this means. For independent expenditures, the current rule is a significant improvement over past rules. There's still a major problem that you have not yet experienced in the city, but that is a growing experience nationally in many other jurisdictions, and that is the problem of C4s laundering their money through other C4s that then give their money to people who do the independent study. So the Committee for Good Government gives to the Committee for Better Government, that gives to the Let's Do Better PAC. And the endorsement, the disclosure is to the committee that does better government. It's nonsense. You get no information out of that. This is what a really good Brennan Center report called Gray Money. There's a good proposal that I quote from past federal proposals. There are others in that report. There are ways of dealing with pass-through money. Unless you deal with pass-through money, what you have now will not work. Hasn't happened yet, but it will. Most important recommendation, and this Mr. Sieglinger was pointing to, without voluntary participation, nothing can be accomplished. Candidates have to buy in. So you have to be aware of the interactions. You should use quantitative models. You should test a variety of hypothetical mixes. And exactly as was suggested, you should look at the actual donor pool in past elections and the actual candidates in past elections and run the models. Who would be affected? How would they be affected? What would those candidates meet to have a reasonable budget for running in the next cycle? This can be done. It should be done. Things to avoid. The charter should continue to protect the Campaign Finance Board's status and budget. This is an unusually competent board that is unusually free from political interference. When you live here, you may not recognize how rare this is. Protect it. Second, take seriously what they say about administrative difficulties. Don't let that be your only priority, but take it seriously. Another point, costs. To be fast about this. This is a bogus criticism that comes up now and then. The total cost under the most optimistic of scenarios that you can imagine is going to bring the total cost up to 0.05% of the city operating budget from the current 0.03%. To put it mildly, this is rounding error. And the errors that big donors get are not rounding errors. They're bigger than that. Next steps. And this goes to the point, I forget which of you, I think it was Mr. Ho made it. The problem with you're trying to do everything now is not how much power do you have versus a city council. It's can you really do the job in 10 weeks? I think it's very hard to run the quantitative models with all of the scenarios and to come up with ballot language that can actually be comprehensible in the course of the 10 weeks you have. My written statement recommends setting parameters rather than numbers. If you do go to final decisions, I strongly urge you not to take shortcuts, to run the models, to take the time, and to actually, should it be 8-to-1? Should it be 10-to-1? Should it be this contribution limit, that kind? Run it with multiple scenarios. Los Angeles shows what can happen when good intentions run into wrong numbers. And it didn't work. Nothing, it had absolutely no effect on small donor participation. It was kind of waste of public policy credit with the public. I mean, that was the previous research in the previous panel. Finally, the Campaign Finance Board obviously does have technical competence. To the extent you want it, we're perfectly happy to weigh in and run models for you if you need them or want them. I didn't even get into my 2-minute warning. I'm happy to take questions.
Congratulations. Dale?
So I appreciate your point about how, this is a carefully calibrated system. You tinker with one piece, you have to worry about how it's going to affect the other pieces. But are there any pieces here, given sort of the complexity of these issues and the limited amount of time that we have, are there any of the pieces here of the recommendations that you have or the ones that CFB has that wouldn't necessarily have reverberations throughout the system? And I'm thinking, for example, eliminating the cap, the cap on matching funds, right? I mean, is that something that you could tinker with without necessarily dealing with?
I actually think if you're prepared to do it, you can run multiple scenarios with different matching rates and contribution limits and come up with answers. Then the question is, can you actually put that into a ballot proposition? I don't think it's impossible to do it. I just think you need to realize that there's a lot of homework and you have a lot of subjects on your plate.
But
on the other one, that's easy, the cap on contribution limits. I don't see the purpose. Therefore, I think it's easy. Apparently, the Campaign Finance Board thinks the purpose, okay. I don't think the other is that hard.
But maybe, I mean, your proposal from the board is to just, go up to 65% or something like that.
That is our proposal, but I would not disagree that this is a piece of the puzzle that's probably more separate from the other interlocking parts, because the additional factor of the expenditure limit. I mean, we don't favor abolishing it, but if that's something that you want to consider, I would agree that it's a less complex piece.
And could you just articulate why you don't favor abolishing it?
I did the best I could. Let Amy see if she can do better.
About the previous point about just, about doing that alone, I think, just either lifting or going to our 65% increase, there are two issues about doing that alone, is that it would further emphasize some of the issues that we have in the current system, that the public matching funds program doesn't necessarily create the incentives for citywide offices, because now, city council candidates would clearly quickly meet the 65, the 100%, or 86%. Citywide offices already have trouble meeting the 55%. So that's that. The reason is twofold again, it's about the idea of the timing. And, while candidates can make their own budget, they do have a spending limit. If 85 or 86% of their money is coming from public funds, and that 86, they can only expect to receive that, most of that 86% of their budget in the beginning of August, certain kinds of candidates would be fine with that because they are the type of candidates who would be able to get credit extended to them, or or get loans from other people. Certain other kinds of candidates would find that more difficult. So that is the timing issue. That's why we recommend a more measured. And the other is something that Rachel brought up and that I brought up before. Is again, if 85% of your budget has to be spent on things that are qualified, that you can document as qualified, it leaves you very little room to do things that you might not. You might have to do. You might have to have ballot litigation. You may have a relative who is a professional campaign consultant. You can't spend public money on a family member, so you wouldn't be able to hire that person. So there's things like that.
All right, let's just move forward. If you'll allow me, Alex, we've been joined by the borough president of Brooklyn, my home borough. We have a very interesting pro and con here on a number of suggestions and reforms being proposed. We did want to hear from you. We understand that you've got your own proposal to reform our election processes, and I wanted to give you an opportunity because the hour draws light. So with that, Eric Adams.
Thank you so much. And I think the first thing that I would like for people to sort of put in the back of their minds that I learned from my days in policing, it's one thing to talk about the principles and philosophy of patrolling the street, but where the rubber meets the road, it's a different concept. And I just wonder that anyone who's here, either sitting at the table here or on the panel, have you ever ran for office? Have you ever tried to call 10,000 people to raise millions of dollars? And that's a real conversation. I have to pay $5,000 a month to a compliance attorney to make sure that that compliance attorney is looking over my documents so I'm not fined for making, which could be some simple mistakes. The number of people I need to hire to input information, the mounds of papers and copies to go after, make sure things are put in right. And at the heart of this conversation that I think people really don't want to engage in is that money is the problem. We should not be spending the hours. I made 10,000 calls when I ran for borough president. You do even analysis of the governor's money. You look at the millions he raised, and close to 2,000 came from small donors. When you look at all the corruption cases that we've had in the last series of corruption cases, it was tied to the money. The expectation that as long as I have to call someone and get them to give me a $5,100 donation, they're not going to do that in the Peak Houses NYCHA development. We did an analysis of where campaign contributions came from based on zip codes, low-income zip codes. You would be surprised how little money comes from those low-income zip codes. So if all of our contributions is coming from the Upper East Side, coming from those communities that are financially sound, then where are the voices of everyday people? There's no incentive to knock on 40 projects. There's no incentive to knock on the Pink Houses, Fort Greene. This community is being left out. And when I looked over my numbers and saw the overwhelming amount of money came from those low-dollar donors. But even if we decrease the dollar amount, even if we say let's move from $5,100 to $2,500, John, the janitor, is going to have a challenge of getting $2,500. Bob, who went to Brooklyn Law School and could call up all of his law school buddies, can reach that number. Until we remove money out of politics completely, I believe we should have a 100% public finance campaign committee. Every dollar should be given by the government. We could reach a qualifier to determine how once reached that level. It could be the number of signatures. We could triple the number of signatures. We could have everyone collect $1 from each person who wants to contribute, and it goes into the campaign system. Other states are looking at different things. The primary foundation to my belief is not based on the philosophy of running the campaign from running the campaign. If it wasn't my relationships with people I've known throughout the years as a captain, or relationships that I come with an edge because I'm elected. There's an edge you come with already. I would not be able to raise the money that I've raised throughout the years. It's not possible. It's not possible if you're a good organizer, a good community person, that you're doing great things in your community and you're a good leader. You cannot do the task that it needs to raise money. You're going to be frustrated. You're going to be tired. You're going to be really put in a position where you don't want to run for office. You know, you just don't want to do it. We're losing good people because of that. And so the conversation of, well, you know, if we give someone $6 million on the campaign finance system for a primary, you'll have someone like a Bloomberg who will spend $100 million. They're going to spend it anyway. You reach a critical mass when there's only a certain dollar amount you need to get your message. Everyone should have the same dollar amount, same period of time. I think we should decrease the period of time that campaigns should take place. The same amount for each office, city council, borough presidents, controller, mayor, public advocate. Citywide election should be the same dollar amount, and we should move towards that level. Anything other than that, we're tinkering around the edges. We're really tinkering around the edges. And I just want to really tell you, money is the enemy. It is always going to be the enemy. We're always going to have a problem with corruption until we get money out of campaigns.
Thank you. You alluded to something that's come up before, which has to do with who would qualify, because I don't think you would advocate that anybody who raises his hand ought to get all the money he needs to run for mayor. You alluded to the use of petitioning. Some people have argued that you ought not to run for office if you can't get 500 people to give you some money. Do you have any reaction to that thought?
I am open to a dollar amount that everyone can contribute based on their community demographics, no matter what it is. If we make that dollar amount $1, then you will see far more people in poorer communities doing so. If we drop from $5,100 to $2,500, you might as well still say $1 million. You're not getting that from the communities whose voices are being unheard.
I appreciate your coming. We've heard privately from many other senior elected officials, but you're here and publicly speaking out, and I know I and probably the whole commission appreciate that. And I, think this is a very strong appeal you're making. I get that you think we should replace the system with a fully publicly funded system, but if we don't, what is your reaction as a candidate to the impact of lowering the contribution limit from $5,100 to whatever it is, $2,500, the $1,000 you can raise to run statewide as a senator or whatever? What is your opinion about the impact that will have on what you need to do to run for office?
So we take John the Messenger, good organizer, able to do the job. Then we take Harry, who's the president of the Brooklyn Bar Association. He holds a dinner. He's going to get 200, 300 people to write that $2,500 check. He's going to max out, and he's going to get the contribution. The young man who's coming from that economically challenging area, he's not getting one $2,500 contribution. So to continue to believe that if we cut it in half or we cut it to $1,000, that's what I really want us to go to the place of. When you ask someone who's basically trying to figure out how they're going to get a loaf of bread to write you $1,000 check, you might as well say, just give me $1 million check. It's not going to reach the target. It's just not going to reach the target. And I can't express that. On the ground, those who run for office will tell you many good candidates never ran for office because they cannot pay for what it takes to run for office.
There's always, how about $500? I'm bidding, $500. Does that make it fair?
I think a good mock exercise is for everyone in CFB, everyone who's making these decisions, to run a mock election. Those who have never felt what it goes to what you go through to run an election can never really understand it. I think to run a mock election, give them the task of calling people and give them a $500. If ever you want people to lose your number, try to raise that $500. See what it is to get that document filled out 100% correct and have to call the person back 4 and 5 times for them to fix something, you're missing your address. They say, listen, I wish I never gave it to you. See what it is to say that you forgot to get the receipt for the Coca-Cola that someone did at a house party, so we want to fine you. See what it is to make all those copies over and over again and keep binders And then all of a sudden, 3 years later, they say, hey, remember that race you ran 3 years ago? We getting ready to hit you with a fine because we finally did your audit? Everyone should go through that at least one time before you make the rules.
Have you had an opportunity, members of the, they people to me.
And they are, trust me, and they're doing their jobs. And I don't criticize. When I was a cop and gave someone the summons for double parking, I didn't want to be criticized. I was doing the job of safety. They're doing their job and they do it to the best they can. We just gave them a task that is difficult. And many of them, trust me when I tell you, they never had to run for office to go for the oversight that they're putting on those who are in office. If they did, they will have a different view of what they're doing.
I want to thank everyone who came and took of their time and testified before us. This has been very instructive. We've got a tough job to do, to come up with some recommendations to see if we can improve our electoral system and get something on the ballot that the citizens of New York City will approve this November. That's our task, and we appreciate your making it a lot easier for us. Thank you very much.
You're so popular. Where do you live now? City or Albany? I'm in Long Island City. I go to Albany quite a bit. Go back and forth. Unfortunately, there's nothing like this in terms of a give and take on these issues in Albany. It's not happening at all. It's very frustrating.
So I'm living in the city now. If you want to get the other side.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. You have a card back there?
If you don't have it, it's going to be out of date. You want to see because